Much. Now, thank you very much, Slit, for inviting me. And just for those who are struggling with the Australian accent and the New Zealand accent, well, I think I'm the last Australian and New Zealand speaker, but I think I'm the quickest speaker. So if anyone just can't understand a word I'm saying, put your hand up or shake your head. Not you, Hugh. So today I'm going to talk about some of the science I've done in Madagascar and Australia. My background in terms of conservation research is quite varied and unusual. I was actually an army officer in Australia before I entered the conservation science world. But I was lucky enough in 2000, after serving in East Timor and doing my operational duties overseas, to be awarded a scholarship to go to England, and it basically changed my life. It diverted me towards conservation-related research. So my undergraduate degree was in military training, and I did my degree in geography and mathematics. So I had no real exposure to conservation science. The reason why I want to talk about that is because when I did my PhD, I found out the hard way that the fact that you're doing science and the fact that you're doing conservation-oriented science may not be effective unless you start doing a few extra things beyond the science. So I'd like to show this map at the beginning of these kind of presentations, just to remind us of the challenge we face. This is the world footprint changing over the last 200 and 300 years. And I'm going to be talking about Madagascar here and Australia here. And you can see they both, the red is the change that humans have had on these countries. And you can see that both countries actually have been drastically altered in the last 300 years. And you can see New Zealand, which we just heard about, has also been drastically altered. So they face significant conservation-related issues. So as I said, I was an army officer. I won a scholarship to go to Oxford University and restart my life and do a PhD in conservation-related research. And luckily, my PhD supervisor took me to Madagascar and said, "Come and do your PhD in Madagascar with me." And he basically threw me in the deep end. So for those who don't know Madagascar, it is it's a country of extreme biodiversity wealth, and also it's got some of the highest endemism in the world. It's been isolated for about 80 million years, so it's got endemic primates. I think 1 in every 3 birds are endemic there, including endemic families of birds, so it's very, very special. But it's also a country of contrast. It's also a country which faces serious issues in terms of development. 1 in 5 children die before the age of 5 because of malnutrition-related diseases. So it's very, very poor. So this is obviously a serious problem in terms of conservation, is trying to develop economically while at the same time save its really very unique biodiversity. I did my PhD down here in the southeast of Madagascar, which is a very unusual part of the country. For those who probably, I think most people mightn't know the evolutionary history of Madagascar and how the island works, but basically there's all these habitats. There's these rainforests on the eastern side and this spiny forest on the southern and western side. And in this corner is where the two habitats collide. So it's a massive ecotone, and it's made up of a very unique forest called littoral forest. In this ecotone and in these forests throughout the country, there's a huge amount of deforestation, which is commonly linked to economic growth. The saddest thing about this economic growth is that you can't normally pinpoint a logging company or a mining company, because it's actually done by the local people who either slash and burn their forests for agriculture. So normally it's a tragedy without villains. But the area I did my PhD was the exception, in that a mining company came into the southeast of Madagascar and said, "We want to clear these forests. We want to clear 90% of them and save 10% of them. But the reason why we're going to do this is that we want to make a lot of money for ourselves, but also put some money back into the local people. We're going to build some schools. We're going to get some chemists. We're going to get some doctors here. So the livelihoods of these people would be improved as well by the presence of the mine." Now, what they said in their impact assessment was very simple. They said that if they conserve 700 hectares of this forest, this littoral forest, which is this very rare habitat which mixes desert species with rainforest species, if we clear 90% of it and leave 700 hectares, this will be enough to conserve all the biodiversity in that region. Now, common sense says that cannot happen, but this is what was accepted by the Malagasy government. The mining company showed very clearly that if they did nothing, the local people would clear their forests anyhow, and by 2030 there'll be no forest left. So they're going to do the country a favour by clearing it rapidly and by conserving 700 hectares. That's doing the country a favour, as opposed to letting the locals slowly clear it over time. So this is a rate of loss that the mining company produced in Madagascar and forest cover. So this is basically the region. Now, I'm not going to talk too much more about what the ecology of this region. I just want to say that I flew into Fort Dauphin and I stayed there on and off for 3 years, and I surveyed all these forests because no one had ever surveyed them before. I looked at their conservation plan and I went and wrote, that's the mine, I went and wrote 8 scientific papers for my PhD, which was apparently a record in terms of the geography department at Oxford University. No one had published 8. So I got some kind of silly award. But I felt very, very good about myself because writing 8 papers in 3 years is very good, and I felt for the first time that I could refute unequivocally that the mining plan was useless. It could not save this biodiversity. I showed through measuring bird movements through the matrix habitat between the forest fragments, by actually going to the core of the habitats, showing that if you degrade and you lose this forest, you will lose lots and lots of species. And I had predictions to show how much you would lose. So I even wrote a conservation management plan, which was 180 pages in length. I wrote it with another co-author, and which said this is what you should be doing if you're going to mine this area. This is a better solution. The truth of the matter is, and the reason why I talk about this, is the fact remained that once I published this research, it made no difference. I completely and utterly failed in terms of stopping the mine. In fact, the lesson I learnt, which is the most serious lesson, is that because I did so much science, I actually forgot to talk to the Malagasy government or the NGOs on the ground. So when I wrote these papers and gave it to these advocacy groups and these government organisations, they didn't know what I was talking about. They had no buy-in to it, and they accepted the science, but they weren't interested in it. And the key thing from all this is the reason why I'm saying this is, as a conservation scientist, I feel that I utterly failed in this situation. Because by doing science for science's sake, by getting these rewards from Oxford University, I failed to actually do what conservation scientists must do, and that is to integrate people and make it a social process into science. So actually, I learned a very significant lesson from that. I think, and it's quite a sad lesson, because now, after 5 years after finishing my PhD, the mining company has now successfully cleared 90% of this forest. So I can now go back to my papers and actually see if my predictions were true, how much species would be lost. And that's a very sad state of affairs, because I'm not an old man, I'm quite a young man, and that in the process of a decade, we have lost some of the most incredible habitat in Madagascar. So I like to tell this story because I think this is a serious challenge in conservation science, in that I did conservation science. I wrote for conservation journals. I did the process of what I think scientists should do in terms of raise awareness, and yet it had no impact. And now, when I look at reflect on myself, I would say unequivocally that I wasn't a conservation scientist. I was simply a scientist. And until we work those terms out and actually reward those conservation scientists who actually go out and actually talk to decision makers and talk to advocacy groups and communicate the results in a way that conservation can be done, you can't call yourself a conservation scientist. It should be held in esteem, not simply every conservation biologist who publishes in conservation biology is a conservation scientist. I think that shouldn't be the case. And I certainly was definitely one of those people. So my story continues. I left Madagascar as a failed conservation scientist and went back to Australia. Now, as you can probably tell, I'm quite a passionate guy, and we talked through the emotions of being a conservation scientist and what Eric's son showed those emotions about being angry and frustrated. I think I'm in a phase of being angry at the moment. I definitely haven't reached the level of acceptance of actually moving forward. I'm still quite angry. But I was more angry when I first moved back to Australia. I went and worked for an environment NGO, which I'll talk about in a minute. What I'd like to talk about in the next 5 or so minutes is the work I've done in the last 2 years working with Hugh Possingham and other colleagues at AIDA. And that is where I think that I've done the most effective conservation science, because I've made sure I've actually integrated with those decision makers the science that actually is important to Australia. But I'd just like to remind the audience, or those who haven't been to Australia, Australia isn't pristine. By any measure, it's not pristine. We have the most mammal extinctions of any country on Earth in the last 200 years. And 99% of Australians don't even know that. And I'd say, as a side issue, that is a serious problem in conservation science, that we have not even communicated our own failures over the last 200 years. So we've cleared an extraordinary amount of our habitats. We've logged and burnt a lot of our forests, which only occur on the rim of the east coast and west coast of Australia. And now salinity is becoming a huge problem. In Western Australia, a football field of salt appears, so a soccer field of salt appears every minute in Australia because of land clearing. This is something which you cannot reverse. So we are facing serious problems. We have introduced many pests. Our farming regimes are very, very terrible. We have now more camels than all of the Arabian countries, apparently, and that, which is true. It's true, and we've got even more goats. So it's a great effort. And we've got a huge amount of species which are endangered, critically endangered and extinct. So we're facing a few serious issues. So as I said, I left Madagascar. I came back to Australia. And I decided that I'd work both with the environment, non-government organisations and the Australian government to try and fix problems as opposed to just writing about problems. So, as I said, I had two different strategies. The first was to work directly with the government. Now, the thing I found, and it was also naive, is that I often believed that all the glossy reports that governments produced about how well they're doing in terms of such as protected area growth or threatened species management, the people who wrote those reports actually believed it. So, I felt that, when you read the reports, the latest report by the Australian government is that they're doing a splendid job in terms of conserving or getting protected areas managed and actually growing our protected areas across Australia. And you can see this is a key report which Australia has sent. This is a key graph that Australia has sent to the CBD, saying that our protected area growth has been enormous over the last 10 years. In just over 20 years, we've almost doubled our protected area state. Aren't we good? So when I read those reports, I immediately get my back up because we're doing very badly in terms of conservation, very, very badly in terms of extinction. The placement of reserves are very, very poor. And so I'd often fire up and I'd write letters to newspapers. When politicians or public senior bureaucrats would come and talk, I'd often be the one harassing them. As Hugh says, pissing them off. I'd be the one. And then I realised when you talk to them behind closed doors, the process of actually being nice to them makes a huge difference because they actually do also recognise that the reports are glossy and they're meaningless. They actually know the problems themselves and they want help. And so we've spent the last few years trying to help them work out what the best way of solving conservation problems in Australia, which is a really nice way to pursue conservation science in a very efficient manner. So quickly, and I'm not sure how much time I've got left, but quickly Hugh and I and a few other people have been actually reviewing how the growth of the protected area system has actually contributed to conservation and look at their own standards and also looked at our standards in terms of threatened species management, in terms of protected area management, and actually showed to them that actually by publishing independent research and working with them with their independent research that actually better solutions can occur. So a good example of this is looking at threatened species in Australia. The grey area is the protected area states. The black area is the ranges of threatened species which aren't captured, and it's simply showing to them that even though the protected area state is quite large, we're missing a lot of endangered species. They're not even closely captured in our reserve system. You can't imagine how powerful an image like this goes towards a politician or a senior bureaucrat because they can immediately see, well, there's gaps in our reserve system, they're not working. Maybe even a more potentially powerful image is designing the reserve system which captures these threatened species in a way that is efficient, which Hugh and Leanne has talked about, the way that is the most cost-effective way of placing your reserves which doesn't piss people off, i.e. goes to areas which they don't want to log or they don't want to farm or they don't want to mine. So go to the areas which actually are avoiding conflict. And producing these kinds of images shows them where they should be prioritising efforts. Now these kind of images, as I said, is incredibly powerful because everyone can understand a map and they can understand the level of the problem in each of the states of Australia. So obviously Western Australia here has a significant problem in terms of protected area management, where states like the Northern Territory up here or South Australia, they need some big reserves in the middle, but apart from that they might have covered off in terms of threatened species management and protected areas. Another thing which we were able to show is that the difference between planning systematically and planning non-systematically, what the differences in costs were. So we wish to show that currently our current situation is that the protected area basically effectively captures about 45% of threatened species, and we set a few targets aside for each of the threatened species in Australia, and that if you wanted to systematically plan your reserve system to capture these threatened species, you could get up, you could get everything at about 20%. So that, which is actually 20% of Australia, you can capture every threatened species. So you're giving a number to a politician, which they can understand. If we get 1/5 of Australia captured in a reserve system, we can protect every threatened species. Now that number actually, that arrow should be way up there actually, it's moved down. But it shows that if you currently plan ad hoc and go through the process that the government is doing at the moment, to achieve this 100% target would mean an extra 75 million hectares. So to show the difference between planning strategically and not strategically, what is useful for conservation planning. And I feel that, again, it might be a dry subject, but this kind of graph really does resonate with the economic rationalists that make up our bureaucrats in the Australian government. So I'll quickly talk about NGOs. I just don't know how much time I've got. 5 minutes. So as I said, the other thing I did was, when I first came back to Australia, was leave academia. I was very, very disgruntled. The fact that I wrote 8 papers and that my forests that I loved in Madagascar were disappearing before my eyes. I thought, I'm going to go tie myself to trees, get myself arrested, really fight the fight in a way that I think is going to win. Again, this is a naive way of looking at it, but when I worked with the environment NGOs in Australia, I realised that you could do science in a way that wasn't very novel, it wasn't very publishable, but it really made a difference. And I'm going to give one quick case study in Western Australia, because I think people might understand it and appreciate it. In the Western Australia, the largest intact Mediterranean ecosystem occurs on Earth. It's called the Great Western Woodlands, and until 4 years ago, it was completely not planned for in terms of conservation, it was planned for mining. So this entire area, 16 million hectares, was completely unallocated to any kind of conservation activity. And the 16 million hectares are the most pristine Mediterranean shrubland and woodland on Earth. So we spent 2 years writing about it and showing the values of this. But the most important thing as a scientist we did was doing media and briefing politicians. Not writing papers, but actually writing glossy reports, naming the region, calling it the Great Western Woodlands, and getting scientists to sign on to this. People like you sign on to these kind of documents saying, we need to actually conserve this big woodland because it's the last intact woodland on Earth. So our biggest accomplishment was to raise awareness in the public and talk to mining groups and Indigenous groups and actually try and achieve conservation on the ground away from academia. And I see that as the most crucial role that conservation scientists can do, is to make sure they raise awareness of the issue and get people to implement action to save those areas or those species. So I'll quickly sum up. In terms of what I've learned from the Australian experience, as I've said, I think working with the Australian government has been effective because you can actually do science which can actually be enacted. Sometimes the science is in media or using means to actually get an idea or a situation out. And the other thing I learned with working with NGOs is that science can be effective, but you've got to make sure that the science drives the campaign and not the campaign drives the science. In Australia in particular, there's a lot of NGOs who will not talk to scientists unless their science backs up their issues, what they want to achieve. And that is a significant problem. So you've got, we are always continually reminding the NGOs in Australia that it has to be science first, which then drives what activities you're doing, not the other way around. So this is what my thoughts. I mean, this doesn't reflect what Hugh or anyone else thinks. But I think that scientists need to play the role, play an active role if they want to be called a conservation scientist. It's my biggest bugbear to meet people in conferences or meet people just, attending workshops with people who say they're conservation scientists. They get access to conservation funding, they write in conservation journals, yet they're unwilling to do anything but science. I think to be called yourself a conservation scientist, you've actually got to actually actively do something, because the word conservation or to conserve is a doing word, it's a verb. So you've got to actually actively do something. And I think we should be far more strong in terms of reminding people of that. And if you're not willing to do something, that's okay. You don't have to do something. You just can't call yourself a conservation scientist. And you shouldn't be able to access conservation funding or conservation scientific or conservation-oriented scientific funding. You should be accessing ecological funding or biological funding. It should be very clear cut. And I think we're very bad at reminding people of this. And I think also that, and I'll leave off with this, is that it's great to do education. It's good to talk to managers, policy makers, practitioners, and it's obvious you can't do everything, but I'll make a stand here in that it's also very important that conservation scientists go into advocacy or direct action in terms of actually making a stand over an issue. I failed in Madagascar over that, and the forests that I studied are gone. They've disappeared. So I think now we've got to realise that we've got fundamental choices to make, not just in Australia, around the world, and we've got issues which are very significant. And if scientists aren't willing to actually become advocates and actually start raising awareness of issues, then we really are just simply going to fail. So I'm very passionate about that point. But thanks for listening to me. Thanks. That's a really good question. I left the NGO because at the end of the day, after 2 years, I was the chief scientist, or effectively the chief scientist, and that idea of campaign-driven science versus science-driven campaigning really started to affect my work, because I was being ignored over issues of science because the campaign wanted to keep on going in a way that it wanted to go. So I realised after 2 years and some successful campaigning, successful science, I'd reach a dead end. And so, which is okay. I think people living in NGOs, anyone who works in an NGO, hats off to you. It's extremely hard work. It's not well paid, extremely stressful. So, and after 2 or 3 years in an NGO, I think people always need a bit of a break. So I was ready for a bit of a break. The truth is, I didn't want to go back to academia, and but the truth is, Hugh Posium, and I got to know Hugh Posium quite well. And when we talked about going back into academia, he made it very clear, and he always makes it clear, not just to me, but to all his postdocs, that what he wanted to do was conservation. So you've got to do conservation. Now, to have a boss give you that freedom was very, very powerful for me. So I could then go, okay, I can now explore these other issues. Maybe that's an exception. I'm not sure how many other professors are allow people simply to do what they're passionate about, and that the papers will come. I think that's Hugh's philosophy, that as an academic, you'll always want to write papers because it's just intellectually interesting, but the action is also very important. But that's why I left there. And after 3 years of working with you, or 2.5 years of working with you, I think that might be time now to explore other options again. So I think you can't live off Hugh forever. That's the only reason I went back to academia, to be honest.
More questions? Okay, thank you very much.